I bought the dish towels on a Thursday. 4 of them, blue and white striped, from the housewares aisle at the discount store on Division Street. They cost $6.43, and they were the last item on a list I had been building for 19 months, a list that started with open savings account and ended, finally, with something for the kitchen. I stood in that aisle for longer than the dish towels deserved, holding them, and I thought about the fact that 3 miles away, my parents were setting up tables in the backyard of the house I grew up in for my sister Claudine's party. They had strung lights. They had ordered a cake. My mother had called 3 florists. I thought about all of that. Then I put the dish towels in my basket and walked to the register. My housewarming started at 2 o'clock. My grandmother arrived at 1:47. She stood in the doorway of my new house. My house, the one I had bought, with my name on the deed, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. What she said changed the afternoon. I need you to understand what the family house meant before I can explain why any of this happened. My parents, Roshan and Mina Stoddard, bought the house on Birchwood Lane in 1998, 2 years before I was born. It is a 4-bedroom craftsman with a covered porch and a backyard with a walnut tree that drops nuts every September and a kitchen where my mother has made the same lamb curry on every significant occasion for as long as I can remember. It is the kind of house that holds a family's entire history in its walls. Every height marking penciled on the doorframe. Every worn patch of carpet at the top of the stairs. The radiator in the hallway that clicks 3 times before it starts. I know that house the way you know a person. Claudine is 4 years older than me and has been treated, for as long as I can remember, as the one whose life required more infrastructure. When Claudine went to college, my parents paid her rent for 2 years after she graduated because she was getting her bearings. When Claudine's car needed a new transmission, my father drove her to the mechanic and paid the $2,847 bill without discussion. When Claudine's apartment lease ran out last spring and she mentioned, offhandedly, that she didn't know what she was going to do, my mother began a sentence and kept starting it for 3 weeks until my father finished it for her at the dinner table one Sunday. He said, "We're thinking of giving Claudine the house." I was 23 years old, still living in a rented room 2 miles away, 19 months into a savings plan I had told no one about. I was sitting across the table from my father with a bowl of lamb curry going cold in front of me. I said, "That's a big decision." My father said, "She needs somewhere stable." I said, "I know." I did not say, "What about me?" I did not say, "I have been saving for 19 months." I did not say, "I am also your daughter, and I also need somewhere stable, and I have been building mine quietly without asking anyone for anything." I said, "I know." I understand now that my parents' decision came out of fear, not calculation. They were afraid of Claudine in a way they had never been afraid of me. Not afraid of her as a person, afraid of what would happen to her without the house. Claudine has always moved through the world with a kind of beautiful, slightly alarming fragility that makes people want to catch her before she falls. My parents had been catching her for 27 years. The house was simply the largest catch of a very long series. They did not sit at that table thinking, "We will give this to Claudine instead of Fiona." They sat there thinking, "Claudine needs this and Fiona will be fine." They were right about the second part. I would be fine. I was already almost fine. I had been building fine for 19 months without anyone knowing. But there is a difference between someone believing you will be fine and someone asking if you are. My parents had not asked. Not once, across 19 months of quiet saving, had either of them said, "Fiona, what are you working toward? Fiona, what do you need? Fiona, you're 23 and living in a rented room. Is there anything we can do?" They asked Claudine those questions. Regularly. They asked Claudine what she needed the way you ask someone who has a diagnosed condition, carefully, with the understanding that the answer might require resources. They did not ask me because I had never given them a reason to think I required resources. And I had never given them that reason because I had learned very early that the way to survive in a family with a Claudine was to become the one who didn't need things. That is a useful skill.
I want to be clear about that.
Being the one who doesn't need things will take you a long way. It will also take you, eventually, to a Thursday afternoon in a housewares aisle, holding dish towels with your name on a deed in your pocket, thinking about a party 3 miles away that didn't include you. That is fine. I had my own party. The announcement happened on a Saturday in March. I was at my parents' house for the monthly Sunday dinner that had somehow migrated to Saturdays, one of those family shifts that happens slowly enough that nobody marks the moment it changed. Claudine was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking the way she looks when she knows something is about to happen. My mother was at the stove. My father was in the doorway to the living room with his arms crossed, which is his posture when he has already made a decision and is waiting for permission to announce it. Claudine did not wait for permission. She said, "Mom and Dad are giving me the house. There's going to be a celebration."
Just like that.
Now we've been discussing, or we wanted to tell you, or what do you think, Fiona? There's going to be a celebration. As though the house and the celebration were both already done, had always been done, and I was simply being updated on a matter of public record. I looked at my mother. She was focused on the pot in front of her with the intensity of someone choosing not to look up. I looked at my father. He uncrossed his arms and said, "We've been thinking about it for a while. It makes sense. Claudine needs the stability." Claudine said, "You could be happy for me." I want to stop there for a moment. You could be happy for me. I had not said a single word. I had not made a face. I had not moved. I had been in the room for 40 seconds. And Claudine had already identified that my silence was a form of not being happy for her. I said, "I am happy for you." My mother finally looked up. She said, "The party is going to be in the backyard. 3rd Saturday of April. We'll do a proper open house, the whole family, the neighbors. It'll be lovely." I said, "That sounds really nice." My father said, "We'd love your help with setup." And there it was. The same sentence in a different month, in a different house. "We'd love your help with setup." Not, "We'd love for this to be a celebration for you too." Not, "We know this is a lot to process." Not even, "What are you thinking right now, Fiona?" Just, "We'd love your help with setup." I said, "I'll see what I can do." I drove home that evening with the windows down even though it was 41 degrees, because I needed the cold air against my face. I had my phone connected to the speakers, and I played nothing. Just drove in silence for the 23 minutes it took to get back to my rented room. I sat in the parking lot for a while before I went inside. The Honda Civic I had bought secondhand 3 years ago with money I saved working weekends at the dental office. The car that was already mine. The car that nobody had given me. The car that had 94,000 miles on it and a small crack in the passenger side mirror, and that I had maintained and insured and paid for every month without anyone's help. I sat there, and I looked at the dashboard, and I thought about the pre-approval letter that had been sitting in my email inbox for 3 days. $187,000. A 2-bedroom house. A porch. A kitchen. I had not told anyone. I opened my laptop when I got inside. I spent 2 hours on real estate listings. I made a list. The next morning, I called my realtor, a woman named B. Norwood I had found through a coworker, and I told her I was ready to move. B. Norwood had been a realtor for 16 years and had the specific patience of someone who has walked many first-time buyers through the gap between what they can afford and what they had imagined. She did not make me feel small about my budget. This mattered to me. Our first showing was a Tuesday in late March, a 2-bedroom on Garland Avenue with a small front yard and a kitchen that needed work. The second was a split level on the north side that smelled like dog and had a furnace that the inspector said had 3 good years left in it at most. The third was a house on Elm Court, 2 bedrooms, a covered porch, a backyard with a young maple tree, hardwood floors throughout, and a kitchen with east-facing windows that let in the morning light. I walked in and stood in the living room for 30 seconds. Then I said, "This one." B said, "You want to see the rest first?" I said, "I already know."
She showed me the rest.
I already knew. The offer went in on a Friday. It came back with a counter. We went back and forth twice. On a Tuesday morning, at 9:14 a.m., B called me at the dental office where I work as a hygienist. I was between patients, standing in the hallway with my gloves still on, and said, "They accepted." I stood in that hallway for a moment. The fluorescent light above me hummed. There was the sound of drilling from the room at the end of the hall. I said, "Okay, B said, "Okay, that's it." I said, "I just need a second." She laughed. She said, "Take your time, Fiona." I took about 4 seconds. Then I said, "What's next?" My coworker Kezia had known about the house search from the beginning. She was the one who had recommended B in the first place after her own first-time purchase 2 years ago, and she had been a steady presence across the entire 19 months of saving, someone I could text at 10 p.m. when I found a listing that excited me, someone who understood the specific mix of determination and terror that goes with building something on a salary that most people would not consider sufficient for building anything. The day the offer was accepted, she took her lunch break at the same time as mine, and we sat in the small break room at the back of the office, and she put a coffee in front of me from the good place around the corner, the one we only went to when something counted, and she said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. The counteroffer, the back and forth, the 9:14 a.m. call. She listened with her hands around her own cup, nodding. When I finished, she said, "Does anyone in your family know?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you going to tell them before closing?"
I thought about this.
I had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, in the quiet way you think about things you aren't sure you want to know the answer to yet. I said, "Not before." Kezia nodded. She didn't push. She understood, I think, without my having to explain it, understood that telling my parents before closing meant managing their reactions during a process that I needed to keep clean and focused. Understood that any conversation about my house purchase would inevitably become a conversation about the family house and Claudine, and whether I was doing this because of the announcement, and I could not afford that conversation yet. I needed to close first. Closing was on a Wednesday morning in early April, 3 weeks after the announcement, and 2 weeks before Claudine's party. I signed 43 pages of documents at a table in the title company's office on Riverside Avenue. The title officer, a quiet man named Glenn, handed me each page and told me where to sign. I signed all 43. My hand was steady. I was 24 years old, and I was buying a house, and my hand was entirely steady. Glenn handed me the keys at 11:31 a.m. 2 keys. On a plain metal ring. I held them in my palm for a moment. They were heavier than I expected, which I know doesn't make any logical sense. Keys are keys, but they were heavier than I expected, and then I put them in the pocket of the navy wool coat I had worn to the signing because it was the most serious thing I owned. I called Kezia from the parking lot. She said, "Tell me." I said, "I have keys." She said nothing for a second. Then she said, "Fiona." I said, "I know." That evening I walked through my empty house alone. No furniture yet. The floors were bare hardwood. The east-facing kitchen windows were dark by then, the light gone, but I stood at the counter anyway and looked out at the backyard and the young maple tree, and I thought, this is mine. Every square foot of it. I bought this. Nobody gave it to me. Then I sat down on the floor of the living room with my back against the wall, and I sent 41 text messages. It was 11:48 p.m. on the Thursday before the housewarming. I was sitting on the floor of the empty living room because the furniture wasn't being delivered until Friday morning. I had my phone and the blue and white dish towels I'd bought that afternoon still in the bag, and the mortgage paperwork in a manila folder on the floor beside me. I opened the folder. Not because I needed to reread it. I had read it 17 times. I opened it because I needed to see the number. $184,500. My name.
My address.
I sat there and I thought, what if nobody comes tomorrow? Not because they were angry. Not because anyone had told them not to. What if they simply didn't come, the way people sometimes simply don't come, the way I had simply not been included in 100 small things across 24 years, and I was left here in an empty house with 41 paper plates and a mortgage and nothing else. I sat with that thought for a long time. I did not call anyone. I did not text Kezia. I just sat with it until I was done sitting with it, and then I put the folder back in the bag, and I lay down on the hardwood floor with my coat over me, and I fell asleep. The furniture arrived at 9:15 Friday morning. 2 men named Derek and Sam, a truck, a sofa the color of cream, a bed frame, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf, a small lamp. By noon the house had the approximate shape of a home. Kezia arrived at 1 o'clock with a box of things she called essentials. Dish soap, a sponge, 2 mismatched mugs she said were good luck, a small succulent in a terracotta pot for the kitchen windowsill, and a card that said, "You built this, Fiona." I put the succulent on the windowsill, above the east-facing window. It looked exactly right there. At 1:30, I texted my parents. "Wanted you to know, I bought a house. Housewarming is today at 2:4114, Elm Court. Would love to see you." I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. At 1:47, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and my grandmother was standing on the porch. Her name is Prabha Mehta. She is 73 years old and has lived in Spokane for 41 years and has the particular stillness of a woman who has watched a great deal and chosen, most of the time, to say very little. She was wearing her good gray sari, and she had taken the bus because she does not drive, and she was 45 minutes early. She had a small tin of coconut barfi wrapped in a cloth, the ones she makes every Diwali, the ones I have eaten every Diwali since before I can remember. She looked at me. She looked past me into the house. Then she said, "I have been waiting to see this day since you were 17. I said, "Nanny." She said, "Don't say anything. Show me the kitchen." I showed her the kitchen. I showed her the east-facing windows and the backyard and the maple tree and the covered porch and the bedroom with the window that faced west. She walked through every room without hurrying. In the kitchen, she opened a cabinet and closed it. She ran her hand along the counter. She said, "This is a good house." I said, "I know." She said, "You did this yourself." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good."
Just that. Good.
By 2:30, 19 people had arrived. By 3:34. By 4 o'clock, 39, too short of the full 41, which is as close to a full guest list as any gathering gets. Kezia brought samosas from the South Asian grocery on Indiana Avenue. My coworker Jerome brought a 6-pack and helped carry the folding table from my car. My neighbor from 2 houses down, a retired teacher named Mrs. Holloway, came over at 2:15 with a plate of cookies and said she was glad someone young was moving in. 3 of my college friends drove from Seattle. The realtor came because I had invited her, and she said she had never been invited to a client's housewarming before, and she wasn't going to miss it. My parents arrived at 3:47. I watched my mother walk through the front door and stop. Just stop in the entry, looking at the living room, the people, the light, the cream sofa, the bookshelf already filling up with things. She said, "Fiona." I said, "Hi, Mom." She said, "When did you?" I said, 19 months ago, give or take." She looked at my father. He was standing just behind her, holding the small plant they had brought, looking at the room with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Something that was trying to find its shape. I said, "Come in. I'll show you around." 6 people attended Claudine's party across town. I did not know this until Sunday. But I am getting ahead of myself. My grandmother was sitting in the good chair, the armchair I had bought secondhand and recovered in a gray fabric that matched absolutely nothing and I loved anyway, with a tin of coconut barfi on the side table and a cup of tea in her hands. She watched the room the way she watches most things.
Steadily.
Without hurry. At some point in the late afternoon, when the room was full and loud and the samosas were almost gone, she caught my eye from across the room and gave me a very small nod. I understood it completely. Sunday morning my mother called at 8:52. I was already up. I had slept in my house, the first full night, and woken early and made tea and stood at the east-facing windows, watching the light come in. The succulent on the windowsill was catching the sun. I had my hands around the mug, and I was in no particular hurry about anything when the phone rang. My mother said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Good morning, Mom." She said, "Fiona, why didn't you tell us you were buying a house?" I said, "I'm telling you now." She said, "You know what I mean." I did know what she meant, and I had been thinking for several days about how to answer it honestly without either softening it into untruth or sharpening it into an attack. I said, because I needed to do it without it becoming a conversation about Claudine. Silence. I said, Every time I've had something going on, every time there was something in my life that mattered, it became a conversation about what Claudine needed, or how Claudine was doing, or what Claudine's situation was.
I didn't want to do that with this.
I needed this to be mine start to finish. My mother said, "That's not fair."
I said, "Mom,
"You asked me to help set up for her party, the week that I was closing on a house." More silence. She said, "We didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't. That's what I'm telling you." There was a long pause. Then she said, "How long have you been saving?" I said, 19 months. Another pause. A different quality to this one.
Softer.
She said, "You were saving while you were still in that rented room." I said, "Yes." She said, "Fiona, why didn't you?" I said, "Because you didn't ask, Mom." Not once in 19 months did anyone ask what I was working toward. I know that's not how it felt from your side, but from mine, nobody asked. She didn't say anything for a while. I could hear the sounds of her kitchen in the background, the specific click of a stove being turned on. She said, 6 people came to Claudine's party. I said, "I heard." She said, "She's very upset." I said, "I imagine she is." She said, "She thinks you did it on purpose." I said, "I did it on a Saturday because that's when my house was ready to show people." The timing with Claudine's party was not something I engineered. This was true. It was also true that when I had looked at the calendar and realized both events fell on the same day, I had considered moving my housewarming to a different weekend. I had considered it for about 45 minutes. And then I had decided no. My house was ready on that Saturday. My guests had already been invited. I was not going to move my life around Claudine's calendar for the 14th time. I did not say all of that to my mother. Some things are true and do not need to be said in the first conversation. I said, "Mom, I love Claudine. I'm not trying to hurt her. But I bought a house. I needed to celebrate it." Those two things are both true at the same time. Claudine called on Tuesday. I had been waiting for this call with the specific kind of waiting that is not anxiety, exactly, but is paying attention. The way you pay attention when you know a thing is coming and you have decided how you want to meet it. She said, "You knew." I said, "What did I know?" She said, "You knew about my party. You did your thing the same day on purpose." I said, "Claudine, I closed on my house 3 weeks before your party. I planned a housewarming for the first available Saturday. The timing overlapped." She said, 6 people came to my party." I said, "I'm sorry about that." She said, "Are you?" I thought about whether to answer that honestly. Claudine has always been able to read a pause. I said, "I'm sorry you had a bad day."
I mean that.
She said, "You had 40 people." I said, 39 confirmed. 39 came. She said, "You knew about mine, and you didn't even try to?" I said, "Claudine."
Gently.
Not sharply. I bought a house by myself. I saved for 19 months. I signed 43 pages of paperwork. I did all of it without asking anyone for anything. I had 1 day to celebrate it, and I invited the people who had shown up for me. I'm not apologizing for that. She was quiet. I know what drives Claudine. I have had 24 years to study it. Claudine's fear is not that she will fail. It is that she will be ordinary. The family house was not just property to her.
It was proof of something.
Proof that she was the one who mattered enough to receive the most significant thing the family had to give. 6 people at a party was not just a bad turnout. It was evidence, unwanted, conclusive evidence, that the world did not organize itself around her the way she had believed it did. I do not say that with contempt. I say it because I spent 24 years watching my family organize itself around that fear, and I spent 19 months deciding I was not going to let it organize me. She said, "Nanny came to yours." I said, "Yes." She said, "She didn't come to mine." I said, "I know." There was a pause. Then she said, quietly, and this was the first moment in the conversation where her voice sounded like something other than anger, "She's never missed one of my things before." I said, "Claudine, when is the last time you came to one of mine?" Silence. I didn't push it. I didn't need her to answer. I just needed the question to be in the room. I said, I hope the house is everything you wanted. I mean that too. She said, okay. I said, come see mine whenever you want. My door is open. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, you have a porch? I said, covered. Faces west. Good light in the evenings. She said, I'll think about it. My parents came for dinner the following Sunday. My mother brought lamb curry, which she carried in the same cast iron pot she has used for every significant occasion I can remember. My father brought wine and spent 20 minutes looking at the maple tree in the backyard with an expression I couldn't quite read. Before they left, my father stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the east-facing windows and said, you did this on your own. I said, yes. He said, I didn't know you were, I didn't ask. I said, no. He said, I should have asked. I said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the house is good, Fiona. I said, I know, Dad. It is 11 weeks since the housewarming. The maple tree in the backyard is leafing out. The succulent on the kitchen windowsill has put out a new shoot that I did not expect. I have learned the way this particular house sounds in the mornings, the pipes, the specific creak on the third stair, the way the front door settles when the temperature drops. I know this house the way you know something you chose. Claudine came over on a Wednesday 3 weeks ago. She showed up at 6:30 p.m. unannounced with a bottle of wine and stood on my covered porch and said, I just wanted to see it. I let her in. She walked through every room the same way our grandmother had walked through, slowly looking. In the kitchen, she said, you have good windows. I said, I know. She didn't stay long. She didn't apologize and I didn't ask her to.
But she came.
That is something. My grandmother comes every other Sunday now. She sits in the armchair and drinks tea and sometimes brings the coconut barfi and sometimes just brings herself, which is enough. Some things cannot be given. They can only be built. A house is the clearest version of this truth, but it is the same truth underneath everything else you will ever own. The people who love you conditionally will measure your life against their own comfort. The people who love you truly will show up 45 minutes early in their good gray sari on the bus. Being unseen is not a permanent condition. It is a situation. Situations can be changed. Sometimes you change them quietly over 19 months without telling anyone. What you build in the silence before anyone is watching will outlast every party that was thrown without you. Your family's fear of your becoming is not your problem to solve. Their comfort with your smallness is not your obligation to maintain. I did not do this to punish anyone. I did not do this to prove anything to the people who should have asked. I did it because I wanted a house with east-facing windows and a maple tree and a covered porch that faces west, and I went and built the life that could afford it. If you have been the one who doesn't need things, the one who saves quietly and asks for nothing and shows up to help set up for someone else's party, I want to ask you something. What would your table look like if you set it for yourself?